Story 1. My wife recently served on a jury and was very shaken by the experience. She tried her best to get out of jury duty, but the court required her to attend. It was a murder case involving a man who pulled up to a gas station and noticed a disturbance with the vehicle in front of him. Once he got out, he saw a man violently beating his wife. The man yelled at the husband to stop, which he did, but then he charged at the bystander. The bystander told the husband to stop and not come any closer. The husband noticed the bystander had a gun on his hip and tried to take it from him. The bystander managed to draw the weapon and told the husband to stand down, but the husband kept trying to get the gun, so the bystander shot him once. During this entire situation, the bystander was attempting to call the police. He dropped the phone when the husband tried to seize the gun. The trial lasted weeks. The wife changed her story, claiming her husband was a great man who never harmed her. She asked the jury to give her husband, the father of her children, the justice he deserved for being randomly shot. There was video of the entire event, yet it still took weeks for the trial to conclude. The bystander was acquitted, but it was a close call. That man pulled up to a gas pump and had his life ruined. Story 2. I was involved in a 2-week civil case of medical malpractice. The plaintiff went into emergency surgery with an arterial aneurysm. He was 75 years old and a diabetic smoker. On the operating table, his arteries essentially blew apart due to his age and medical history. The doctor saved his life, but the man woke up paralyzed. Someone suggested to him that he could make a significant amount of money suing the doctor for the paralysis. A surgery that should have taken 1 hour turned into a 10-hour ordeal. The man essentially lost all of his blood, which was replaced and exceeded through transfusion during the surgery. They showed us pictures of the operating room afterward, and I had never seen so much blood in my life. Felt like a scene from a horror movie. We had to take a quick recess because one of the jurors ran to the bathroom to vomit. As a civil case, we had to determine if the doctor had followed the standard of care or acted recklessly. It was absurd. The only reason the man was alive was because the doctor spent 10 hours tirelessly replacing and repairing the arteries damaged by years of smoking. While it was unfortunate to wake up paralyzed, he would have been dead in the hands of any lesser surgeon. It took us longer to select a foreperson than to determine the doctor had followed the standard of care and absolve him of any liability. But I will never forget the images of that operating room. Story 3. During a trial, the defendant was accused of shooting a 15-year-old boy in the back of the neck. At the time of the incident, the victim was walking home next to his best friend, who was also the same age. That friend he appeared sullen and quiet, prompting the judge to ask him to speak louder. At one point, he told the judge to go away, which was not a quiet remark. The situation was a bit shocking. During the trial, we learned that he had run so hard and fast when the shooting occurred that both shoes had come off his feet, and he had hurt himself jumping over a fence. Additionally, we learned that he had cooperated with the police and testified before the grand jury. After the trial, where we found the defendant guilty, we discovered that this was the 3rd time the case had been tried. The first 2 trials had ended in hung juries. This poor boy had been forced to relive what was probably the worst moment of his life in front of 14 strangers on the jury, in front of the man who had murdered his friend, and a courtroom full of observers over the course of several years. It was no wonder he had expressed anger toward the judge. That was in 2019, while the murder occurred in 2015. I hope he has found peace. Story 4. When I was 21, I was part of a jury for a case involving the murder and sexual assault of a young woman. Throughout the trial, they showed us pictures of her naked corpse to illustrate that she had been assaulted both before and after death, while trying to blame the victim. I didn't sleep well for months after the trial and occasionally still have nightmares about it. Story 5. I watched a video of a social worker interviewing a small boy, about 6 to 8 years old, about his grandfather being killed in front of him. They had been having a family barbecue at the grandfather's home when an issue arose with a neighbor. The grandfather went over to talk to the man, and his grandson grabbed his hand and walked with him. When the neighbor opened the front door, he shot the grandfather almost immediately, then closed the door in the little boy's face as the man bled out beside him. The boy's father, the victim's son, refused to subject the child to any more trauma by having him testify in court and see the man who shot his grandfather. Therefore, the video was all we had from shortly after the incident. Watching that little boy sit in a room with the social worker and recount the murder while playing with toys and showing little emotional response was harrowing. Story 6. I have served on a few different juries. Nothing unusual there. However, while in college, I had to observe and report on both federal and state court proceedings. The one trial that I think about often was an expert witness in a manslaughter case. There were images from the night of the incident, a large parking lot with a motel, trees, and lights. The expert provided a representation of how the scene would have looked at the time the car struck the victim. They answered questions about moonlight, headlights, lamplight, trees casting shadows, reflections from other cars in the lot, and the motel's windows. It was remarkable to me that there was an expert focused solely on light and visibility. They interviewed him for 2 days and then brought him back for clarification on a few points the jurors were curious about. I have never forgotten that experience. It has been 16 years. Story 7. The 2 times I have served on a jury, most of the other jurors did not want to consider the evidence or discuss the case. They simply wanted to vote guilty and go home. That is frightening. Story 8. I served on a jury for an animal abuse case. There were additional charges such as assault, trespassing, and larceny, but animal abuse was the main focus of the case. The animal abuse involved sexual contact with an animal for a sexual purpose. The defendant became heavily intoxicated and attempted to engage in sexual acts with a neighbor's dog. He was apprehended before he could complete the act. I wish I were joking about any of this. Story 9. I served on a murder trial when I was 19, about 13 years ago. The victim was involved in a shootout with his killer. The hardest part to witness was definitely the autopsy photos. There is one particular image that I can still see in my mind's eye, showing the exit wound in the back of the victim's head. At the time, I felt permanently changed, but honestly, I don't think about it anymore unless someone mentions jury duty. I'm not sure if that's a good or bad thing. Life simply moves on, and I have had my own personal tragedies and struggles to deal with. I wish peace to the family, but I was just a very temporary part of that experience. I feel that we made the right choice based on the evidence presented to us, and that is all I could do. As I reflect on this, I recognize that I would have found it much harder if the defendant hadn't admitted his guilt and tried to argue self-defense. In Colorado, once a target has been neutralized, if you continue to enact violence on that person, you are no longer covered by self-defense laws. The defendant shot the victim in the head first, at which point he might have been able to argue self-defense. The victim and his family happened to be at a nearby Dairy Queen, and multiple witnesses corroborated that the victim got out of his car and walked down the street toward the defendant's house. There was a history of conflict between them, which makes it suspicious that the victim was there when he lived in Denver. However, multiple witnesses and forensic evidence showed that once the victim was on the ground from the initial gunshot wound to the head, the defendant walked around a car and fired 2 more shots into his back. At that point, it was no longer self-defense, and the case came down to first or second-degree murder. Story 10. A young girl was raped by her stepfather, and an elderly lady on the jury, who was 80 years old, commented that the girl should have known it was wrong because she was a Christian. I believe every other juror was shocked by this statement. Story 11. I was on a grand jury. We had a case where an individual broke into his parents' home, killed them in a gruesome manner, and then called 911. The police responded and shot him. We were deciding whether to charge the police officer. As part of the presentation, we saw the video taken by the crime scene investigators, which included the mutilated bodies and various body parts strewn around the house. It was more than 20 years ago, but sometimes I still think about it. The incident occurred in suburban New Jersey, where we do not get a lot of shootings. The young man had a long history of mental illness and had moved out of state. For reasons unknown, he returned to his childhood home very early in the morning. No one knows for sure what happened, but he called 911 and reported that he had killed his parents. 2 police officers arrived, entered the house, found the bodies of the parents, split up, and began to search the house. The young man emerged from a room armed with a knife and approached one of the officers. According to his report and his partner's testimony, he ordered the young man to stop and put the knife down, but eventually shot him. The other officer was a trained emergency medical technician and immediately began to treat him, but he did not survive. At first, it seemed like a justifiable shooting, but family members raised concerns about his long history of mental illness and accused the police of excessive force. They questioned why the officer did not use pepper spray or try to subdue him physically. They claimed that he had no history of violence. The prosecutors decided to charge the officer in the death of the young man and present all the evidence to a grand jury. They even moved the case to our county to ensure the jury had not been influenced by publicity or the county's prosecutor. We spent an entire day on the case and considered many factors, including the young man's mental history, the officer's record, the video of the crime scene, and reports from the pathologist. The officer who was accused did not testify, but his partner did. We voted to no bill. That is, we decided there was insufficient evidence to show that the police officer did anything criminal. Story 12. My husband had to hear a case about a man who attempted to cover up his efforts to molest his friend's daughter. The evidence was quite compelling, but one older conservative woman held out and claimed that the 11-year-old was lying. He still thinks about that poor girl who went through something terrifying, only to be labeled a liar by an elderly individual. Story 13. I handled a case involving child abuse. The parents allowed their young child to move into the teacher's house while they went on a long vacation. They would occasionally email to check on the child. The parents showed neglect and did not want the child. The teacher was inappropriate and further abused the child. The most troubling aspect was that the parents later wanted to sue the school, the teacher, and others in the community for pain and suffering, claiming they did not take better care of the child. In reviewing the background of how the child ended up with the teacher, there were numerous red flags regarding the parents. We wondered why the teacher or school never reported it to Child Protective Services. The parents admitted they knew the child would not be safe with the teacher. The situation raised further concerns about the teacher as well. The whole experience was heartbreaking. It is important to recognize that individuals serving on a jury can experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Story 14. I served on a federal grand jury for 20 months in North Carolina. We heard various cases, including immigration, drug offenses, weapons charges, child exploitation, and a significant racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's investigation into a local gang. We also participated in an investigation into a chemical plant leaking substances into a local river. The case that always stuck with me was essentially a kidnapping case, although I believe the parents were aware of the situation. The perpetrator was a youth pastor who groomed and gained the trust of a 13 or 14-year-old boy. He took the boy across state lines, which led to federal charges, and abused him mentally, physically, and sexually. He even had his name tattooed on the boy. We, of course, voted to indict him. Story 15. I served as a juror on an attempted rape trial. It involved a man who attacked his friend's 17-year-old daughter at her own home, which was absolutely horrible. What really shocked and angered me was one of the male jurors. Despite repeatedly telling us during our deliberations that he had no doubt about the man's guilt, this was a straightforward case with a lot of very good evidence. He didn't want the responsibility of delivering a guilty verdict. Everyone else agreed that the man was guilty, and I was very relieved for the victim when the judge ordered to take him away. However, my opinion of that juror was deeply negative. I would have loved to confront him. Story 16. I participated in a 3-month grand jury assignment. We had one case involving an infant who exhibited all the signs of abuse, and there was suspicion that it might have been the mother. Both she and the father were interviewed, and we had to observe these interviews. The father eventually turned himself in, and we also watched that interview. I learned how an infant's bones and muscles can be affected for life by seemingly minor actions. Out of the 27 grand jurors, a few had to leave the room during the interviews and confession in tears because they were parents. Although I don't have children, I was deeply affected and on the verge of tears at times while hearing about what had happened. We indicted him on every count presented to us. He has been in jail for years and still has more time to serve. To me, that is not nearly enough for essentially impairing his child's life forever. Story 17. How uninformed some members of the jury can be has scarred me for life. Never put your life in the hands of a jury. Story 18. I was on 2 juries in Los Angeles. The first jury included a recognizable model who requested to be excused for financial hardship, and the request was granted. 9 days into the school year, an elementary school teacher from an underprivileged area requested an excuse for financial hardship, but it was denied. This was a civil trial against a famous podcaster, and during the jury selection process, the schoolteacher was finally excused after she made an impassioned statement about all of us suffering because wealthy individuals could not settle an argument. Story 19. 2 girls at work spoke about this today. One mentioned they were called in for 2 days only on a minor case involving someone not paying a fine, so they were not impacted. The other said at the time they were working in an incredibly stressful and toxic environment. Their boss told them, "Even though I can't legally ask you this, if this case lasts longer than a week, you need to find a way to get out of it." The case was about a woman who was brutally beaten by her partner to the point of being blind in one eye. The man who assaulted her was a police officer, so the case revolved around the acceptable level of consequence for him, as he was effectively reprimanded but allowed to continue working. She described it as if 2 thumbs were pressing her down into the ground on both sides. Story 20. I have been called to jury duty 4 times in my life. I ride a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The first time I received a letter instructing me to report to the clerk of the court. I went, dressed in a black leather jacket with a beard and long hair. She took one look and said, "Mr. Cabber, you are excused from jury duty." I did not serve. The second time I attended jury selection, I was eliminated almost immediately. I did not serve. The third time I made it onto the jury. My philosophy was, would I want someone like me on the jury if I were accused of a crime? The answer was yes. However, it was a civil case, and they settled the matter in the judge's chambers. The fourth time involved a juvenile case. A 14-year-old boy charged with felony possession of cocaine for sale. The boy and a group of his friends were hanging out at a drug house in their neighborhood, where older teenagers and young adults gathered. Cars would arrive, and the kids would sell drugs to the motorists. I believe the adults were using the juveniles to hold the drugs. The adult would take the money, and the boy would give the customer the drugs, ensuring that the drugs and the money were never in the same place at the same time, and never on the same person. The police raided the location, and everyone ran in various directions. My defendant and 2 of his friends hid on the balcony breezeway of a nearby apartment complex. The police found them and made the arrests, but the drugs were discovered on the ground in front of the drug house. The police claimed my defendant had tossed the drugs and then fled. Perhaps he did, or perhaps he did not. However, the state must prove its case, and they did not prove it. So we voted not guilty, and the boy was freed. He was so grateful that he was in tears. I told him later in the courthouse lobby, "You need to change the way you are living your life before you end up in prison for real." Who knows? He was likely back out there the very next day. But I certainly hope not. Story 21. I was on the jury for a murder trial. I will never forget the look on the defendant's face when we each had to stand up and deliver the guilty verdict. He looked us in the eye with trembling rage. Story 22. There was no disturbing evidence at the trial in which I participated. It was frustrating that the police likely apprehended the right suspect but lacked sufficient evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So we had to find him not guilty. Story 23. Not really a trial, I was on a grand jury for a month. Most of the cases were not significant to me, but we also heard child sexual assault cases. Having to listen to a young child describe abuse that likely occurred, then potentially deciding that their testimony, the only evidence available, is insufficient to justify pursuing the charge was quite difficult at times. Even knowing that if we were to push the case forward, it would have failed anyway while putting the child through additional trauma. If they are young enough, it is challenging to gather clear statements without leading questions, which could invalidate their testimony. Sometimes we were able to unanimously approve a clear case, but that did not feel cathartic enough to make up for the experience. The case that really stuck with me involved one of the older victims. They were old enough to provide detailed testimony, resulting in a solid case. On the other hand, the details were horrific. As my fellow jurors and I were leaving, we did not take long to decide. The victim and their parents happened to still be in the common area standing in a small group. They looked utterly shattered, the child having had to relive the entire experience and knowing more was to come in the pursuit of justice. The parents seemed unsure of how to comfort their child and were also traumatized, not yet having been informed of our decision. I likely knew more about the abuse that had occurred than the parents did. I wanted to say something, but there was nothing to say, and as I left that heartbreaking scene, it did not leave me. I hope they are doing better now. It was not possible for me to follow their case since I was not involved once it was approved, and the victim's age meant it was not public. I wouldn't say it still affects me, but it is not a pleasant memory, and I will never know how it turned out for them. Story 24. I served as the jury foreman for a 4-week criminal trial with 14 felony charges, including identity theft, possession of stolen goods, and intimidation. The defendants stole mail and identities of senior citizens, opened checking accounts in their names, and wrote bad checks, tricking or intimidating young people into cashing them for him. He then purchased expensive furniture and clothing and rented a lavish apartment. It was an engaging experience. Various experts presented evidence, including fingerprints. While some aspects were tedious, such as 3 days spent authenticating checks and ATM withdrawals, others were captivating, like the police officer who authenticated a video of a high-speed pursuit. We watched this video on a large screen, showcasing a chase through downtown Seattle, which felt surreal, reminiscent of a video game. We also examined the illegally acquired luxury goods and sifted through large stacks of paperwork. The jury was diverse, and it was fascinating to observe how different individuals responded to various kinds of testimony and evidence. Interacting with everyone in the jury room was rewarding, as we worked towards reaching a consensus. In the end, we convicted the defendant on 11 of the 14 charges after 2.5 days of deliberation. I enjoyed the process and felt a profound sense of civic pride. Story 25. I served on a case involving ongoing sexual abuse of a child by her father. This charge required proving the abuse occurred multiple times over a specific time frame. The first week focused on establishing timelines and the relationships of all involved, as the victim had complex medical issues that needed to be detailed. The last week involved the victim, and eventually her brother, describing their experiences of abuse. I had a 45-minute commute home and spent most of that time crying. It was awful. I'm glad I contributed to seeking justice for her, but it was very emotionally taxing. Story 26. A federal case involved child pornography charges. The prosecution presented 4 videos found on the defendant's hard drive. We found him guilty, and he was later sentenced to 12 years. After the trial, the district attorney spoke with us and apologized for having to show us the clips, but mentioned that if they hadn't, the defense would argue whether it was truly child pornography. It was difficult to witness and will unfortunately remain in my memory. People can be disturbing. Story 27. I got to hold the bag that contained cocaine, which had been hidden by an inmate. It was being passed around the jury as evidence. Story 28. I wasn't on the jury, but I attended every day of the murder trial for my ex, the father of my oldest child. He was on trial for murdering his grandmother. It was revealed during the trial that he had stabbed her 36 times and sexually assaulted her, with his DNA found in and around her genitals, and no one else's DNA found anywhere on her or at the crime scene. He was the most disturbing part of the whole situation. At one point, he sat at the defendant's table watching videos with headphones in. When he took the stand, he tried to speak to the jury members while counsel approached the bench, and the bailiff had to stand between them. He blamed the DNA found on her on the fact that they shared the same shower and bathtub. During closing arguments, he blew a kiss to the jury. On his way out of the courthouse after his guilty verdict, which took less than 10 minutes, he gave the cameras a peace sign. I used to be unable to say his name out loud because he abused me when we were together. I was 16 and he was 21 when I finally got the courage to end the relationship after becoming pregnant. Even then, it ended with him being arrested for trying to prevent me from leaving the house. I had to undergo years of therapy and was finally brave enough to face him at this trial. He is currently going through the appeal process, but I have faith that the verdict will stand, and I do not let the situation bother me anymore, aside from the normal human response of reflecting on what a horrible situation it was. Story 29. Trial for indecent exposure. I saw pictures of a man engaging in inappropriate behavior in an alley. It was both amusing and distasteful, so there will be no long-term effects. Story 30. I was a juror on a rape trial. The first victim was a black woman, but the police did not bother to investigate or look for the rapist. She provided a significant clue in the emergency calls, stating that he drove a bright purple sports car. There cannot be that many bright purple sports cars, regardless of where you live. The police never investigated. The second victim was white. They apprehended the suspect within an hour of the incident. If the police had investigated the first case, there would not have been a second victim. Racism hurts everyone. Story 31. I was assigned to a case where we had to decide if a man was guilty of aggravated reckless driving. He had been pursuing another car down the highway and veered into the bike lane, hitting a cyclist and dragging them, which resulted in a broken back and a fractured skull. It should have been an obvious guilty verdict, but there were many complications during deliberation, and the half that favored a not guilty verdict prevailed. I have always regretted not standing my ground. Story 32. Child abuse case. The accused was a trusted family friend of the victim. This was the third attempt in court due to 2 previous mistrials, and it ended in the same way. Rough. Story 33. I haven't been on a jury in a traditional sense, but I was one of 3 members on an administrative separation board in the Navy. The case involved a senior enlisted individual with 19.5 years of service who was up for separation for repeatedly abusing his teenage daughter. Additionally, he had cancer, and we unanimously voted to separate him from service without benefits, meaning his cancer would go untreated, and he was less than 6 months away from qualifying for retirement benefits. It was a difficult day to hear the details of his actions, and knowing that, despite his behavior, our decision essentially ended his life as well. This was not what I expected when I volunteered for a day away from my command to serve on that board. Story 34. The only time I was on a jury, the defendant was a woman on trial for hitting her boyfriend, and it was all on video. Another juror initially wanted to vote not guilty simply because he said he probably deserved it. He eventually changed his mind, and she was convicted. Story 35. I sat on a murder trial about a year ago. The worst thing I witnessed was the apathy displayed by other jurors toward the process. They were on their phones in the jury box, dozing off during expert witness testimony, and so on. It was eye-opening to see how little those responsible for someone else's life cared about being present during the proceedings. Having a trial by your peers should be terrifying, as your peers are often not particularly knowledgeable. Story 36. I served on a jury for a federal child exploitation case. Some things are difficult to forget. We were offered free counseling for up to 6 weeks after the trial if we needed it. We found him guilty, and he received a 30-year sentence. Story 37. I have served on 4 juries. A stalking and harassment case. Guilty. A woman ended an affair, confessed to her husband, and they decided to work things out. The affair partner became obsessive, sending threatening letters to her and her husband, even certified ones, and following them around, which was very unsettling. A case involving an inmate who used a cup of feces in his cell to retaliate against his neighbor. He believed the guards were trying to poison him, refusing his lunch. The guards testified that it was loud and the cells only had a small window on either side of the door, making it difficult to hear or see down the hall. Eventually, the inmate wanted his lunch and became upset, tossing his cup of feces through the small opening into the hallway and hitting a guard. The guard filed a lawsuit. If it was intentional, the inmate was guilty. If it was an accident, he was innocent. The jury could not reach a unanimous decision. A case of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon involved 2 machetes at a house party that went wrong. There were multiple charges, and the jury found the defendants guilty of some but not all. We believed the victim was likely also guilty of aggravated assault and should have been charged, but it was not our decision. We did mention this to the judge and prosecutor afterward. An attempted murder case involved a witness in another trial who was shot in the head and survived. Guilty. This case was particularly impactful. The defendant was a dangerous individual, and most of the evidence was circumstantial, making it challenging. There was video of the shooting and audio of the defendant bragging about the crime to an undercover officer. Many witnesses testified, and I feared for their safety since the defendant had threatened to kill witnesses. When we read the verdict, there were more police in the courtroom than I had ever seen, which was intimidating and confusing. The judge explained afterward that the defendant was being arrested for killing another witness and was taken to a different city where that crime occurred. I truly felt for the woman who was shot and for everyone brave enough to testify against him. It was a horrific situation. The original crime involved identity theft, similar to the scam depicted in the movie Emily the Criminal. The defendant initially faced a maximum 3-year sentence. Story 38. Former court clerk who recorded verdicts from juries. I have seen countless crime scene footage of the moment someone dies, heard horrific emergency calls, and other atrocities, which have made me deeply disillusioned with humanity. People can be terrible. I'm quite sure my therapist has profited significantly from our sessions, and may even have some form of secondary trauma. Story 39. Not me, but one of my close friends. The jury couldn't agree on a rape case. 2 men claimed it wasn't rape because the woman went on a date with the man. A female jury member shared her story, yet the men still didn't understand. The case was dismissed because, under my country's law, the rapist must know that the other person is not consenting, and the rapists just lie. Story 40. I was in my early 20s and was cornered and repeatedly approached by the elderly, intoxicated defendant while his lawyer frantically tried to get him to stop and not talk to the jurors. Part of the defense claimed he doesn't drink, but I could smell alcohol on him, and his behavior appeared very intoxicated. Story 41. The allegation of child rape by the father lacked any evidence, originating from a bitter ex-wife. The case went to a grand jury and subsequently to a full jury trial, in which I participated for 2 weeks. The jury unanimously found the defendant not guilty on all charges. In his closing remarks, the judge stated that the state prosecution should never have pursued this case. The most distressing aspect was that the father had been barred from seeing his daughter and had spent 18 months in prison because he could not afford bail. His life was essentially devastated by these accusations. For the jurors, the most troubling part was listening to the ex-wife's outrageous claims, only for forensic evidence to confirm that there was no basis for any of it. The details were very graphic. Story 42. I was on a 3-week trial for a drunk driving case. You might think drunk driving would be straight, felt almost like a television show. A high-speed car crash occurred in the middle of the night. A single car hit a tree, resulting in 4 instant fatalities. It took hours before the police on the scene found the 5th occupant, who had ended up a distance away in a field with only minor injuries. It was that 5th person's car, but everyone was so disoriented from the crash that they had no idea who had been driving. Every single person in the car was over the legal alcohol limit for driving. There were no witnesses to confirm who was in the car before it left the bar. The defendant was blackout drunk and remembered nothing. Therefore, it was the jury's responsibility to determine if it was the one survivor or not. The jury heard from experts on both sides, about a week for each side. The prosecution presented a crash reconstructionist, while the defense brought in a physicist. Ultimately, the police botched the evidence collection and failed to test seemingly important items for DNA, making it impossible to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that it was the survivor. In such cases, we had to declare them innocent of all 20 manslaughter charges. The prosecution was frustrated. Naturally, the parents of the other occupants sought someone to blame. There were many police officers stationed around the court when the verdict was announced to protect the accused. The jury received threats and had to be escorted out by police as well. It was a difficult case all around. I still see the photos of the deceased from the crash and during the autopsy when I try to sleep, and I remember all their full names. The prosecution attempted to appeal to our emotions by frequently presenting the photos and names, but ultimately, they could not make their case. The jury itself was an unusual mix. The only people who could serve the full 3 weeks were either fresh out of school and unemployed or older and retired. We received certificates of appreciation from the judge and an extended reprieve from being called again, which, from what I understand, is not typical. Story 43. Served 3 years ago. Autopsy photos of a 4 to 6-year-old boy show the grill imprint on his chest. I cannot remember the exact age, but I still see the photos in my mind. I had to look at the dead child's father and see the college student who hit him to determine if he was at fault. I couldn't make it to work that night because the image of the child and his grilled imprint on his flesh haunted me when I closed my eyes. Story 44. The victim's blood-soaked jean jacket was pulled from an evidence bag after more than 20 years of being in storage. The smell of dirt and caked blood will stay with me forever. Story 45. I guess it was greed. My case involved a slip and fall, and we were all wondering why it wasn't settled out of court. Since it was a civil case, we had to determine which party was more at fault and the amount to be paid. We settled on the lower end of what the lawyers suggested, agreeing that the fault lay 40% with the person who fell and 60% with the business owner. As a result, the business owner only had to pay 60% of the agreed amount. At the end of the day, the only people who made any money were the lawyers, and we were frustrated that this went to court. Story 46. The second time I had jury duty, it was a federal case involving Native Americans and non-natives. The case concerned a father who sexually molested and secretly recorded photos and videos of his own daughters from 2 marriages in bathrooms and closets over the course of several years. The daughters ranged in age from 8 to around 16. As part of the trial, all the photos and videos had to be presented as evidence. The trial lasted a week. Ultimately, we decided on a conviction for approximately 8 charges in about 15 minutes. Story 47. Was selected as the foreman on a double murder case. The jury deliberated for 2 days. It was a struggle, but since he had stolen money in his pocket when arrested, it proved he robbed one victim after the shooting. I couldn't convince a few jurors that running and continuing to shoot someone in the back indicated premeditation. He was found guilty of first-degree and second-degree murder. Many years later, I was working in a prison 300 miles away when this man showed up there. He had appealed and was only serving 15 and 16 years concurrently. The only thing that bothered me was the lack of consistency in sentencing. Murderers serve anywhere from 15 years to life, which is a huge difference. I found the whole process very interesting. Story 48. Last year, I served on a jury for a 39-year-old cold case involving first-degree murder connected to a love triangle from 1985. The victim had been shot in the head at point-blank range. The hardest part was not the autopsy photos. It was knowing her children were less than 15 feet away from me, witnessing the same terrible things. Story 49. I have been a juror twice. Both experiences were quite unsettling. The first case involved a murder in Edinburgh. It did not affect me personally, although the defendant received a life sentence, and I occasionally calculate when he will be eligible for parole. The images of the victim were the most distressing part for obvious reasons. The second case involved a man who possessed child abuse images on his computer. This case was unusual as he eventually pled guilty halfway through the trial. As a result, we did not need to fulfill our role as jurors and were sent home after a week. Although we were not shown the images, we did see the file names associated with them, which was quite grim. Story 50. Not duty but was a court security officer. It was a restraining order case, and the police were looking to get her relocated. The magistrate was questioning how he found her new address, and the police said she called him again. Frustrated, the magistrate asked her why she would do this and why she doesn't find a new partner. Her answer is forever stuck in my head. I've tried, but they don't love me like he does. They don't beat me. Story 51. I served as a juror in a trial concerning rape and sexual assault committed by a member of the clergy. He admitted that the acts occurred but argued that they were not related to his position of authority. The most troubling aspect was witnessing older women acknowledge their own experiences of abuse from their youth yet still refuse to believe the victims in this case. They placed blame on the victims and made harsh, hurtful comments repeatedly. I think about this every day because he was acquitted of most of the charges. It shook my confidence in people and occurred right before the last election, so my confidence was already low. Story 52. Yes, it was a child grooming and molestation case that received coverage in newspapers. It was described as one of the wilder and worst cases for law enforcement. It was chaotic, and the defendant claimed he was acting in self-defense. He recorded his crimes with a boy and a girl, making them touch each other and then himself. I had to watch the videos twice, once for the prosecution and again for the defense, with his commentary totaling 3 to 4 hours of tape. Everyone was clearly affected. Half of the jury cried. One of the shocking moments was when he proposed to a witness, an old girlfriend, while she was under oath. She said no. He also asked the mother of the children, whom he was dating, if she still loved him. She said no, and then he called her derogatory names and questioned her for about 3 hours, discussing their love life and his performance in bed. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with many recesses due to his outbursts that forced us to leave the courtroom. It was revealed later that prison guards were beating him at night during the trial, but he deserved it. Story 53. I served on a civil jury for a car accident case about 5 months after I passed the bar exam. I was surprised they didn't use a peremptory challenge on me, but after the trial, I realized there were good reasons why both sides kept me on. The individual, who was in his 60s, had actually experienced 2 accidents in the span of about 3 months. In the first incident, he was struck by a street sweeper traveling at about 35 miles per hour, which left him with significant injuries. Their case settled that morning. The case I was on the jury for involved a 5-mile-per-hour fender bender at the bottom of an exit ramp, resulting in a small scratch and dent on the back bumper of his car, about the size of a silver dollar. He claimed that it exacerbated the injuries he suffered in the first accident and worsened his fibromyalgia. The plaintiff wanted me on the jury because they thought I would focus on the eggshell plaintiff rule, while the defense wanted me on because they knew I would approach it logically. Ultimately, we found for the defendant because it was not physically possible for a minor bumper tap to cause the injuries he claimed. The street sweeper accident was the cause, not the bumper tap. What surprised me the most was the process of deliberation. Jurors are not supposed to consider anything other than the evidence presented at trial, but the others mostly ignored that. My favorite moment was when someone said, "My sister has fibromyalgia, and it doesn't work like that." It was fascinating as a novice lawyer to see how the process actually unfolds. Story 54. I was on a murder and attempted murder trial where the victims were children. The defendant was their father. He shot both children in their heads while they were lying together in a bunk bed. His daughter was shot 3 times and his son 2 or 3 times, with 1 round going into the wall. When the gun was recovered, the magazine was empty. The full details are horrific. The evidence was overwhelming against the father, and we convicted him. However, to this day, I can still see his daughter's autopsy photos when I close my eyes. As for coping with it, my trial ended on a Thursday, so I told my boss I couldn't come in that Friday. I booked a hotel and went out of town to a place I regularly visit. I ended up unloading all my trauma on a bartender that Friday and visited another bartender friend the next day. Since I didn't have to drive, I had a few drinks and then returned to my room. The next day, I went home. I was still struggling with some aspects of it, but I know many first responders through my job. I talk to them since they frequently encounter traumatic situations. Speaking with someone who understands what I experienced helped. I don't think I'll ever forget what I saw, but I'm in a better place mentally now. Story 55. I had grand jury duty in my medium-sized city. A few cases were very sad, but the evidence and photographs didn't haunt me. I think most of us consume enough legal dramas and true crime stories to be desensitized. One cold case murder opened with a man who had found the body. It had been over 20 years, and he still cried on the stand recounting that day. I still think about him sometimes in a way that reflects how our actions can have a large and unintentional impact on others. The accused definitely didn't mean to hurt anyone besides the victim. Yet this man had nightmares for decades. Another notable aspect was just how social people are. My group of jurors represented a perfect mix of age, gender, race, and class. It was a good representation of the population. Most of them I had neutral or fond feelings for. The most annoying juror was a woman who acted like she was the main character in a courtroom drama. She asked the most irrelevant and far-fetched questions of witnesses, and you could tell she thought she was smarter or more invested than the rest of us, which was not the case. It annoyed me because she sat at the front and often wore workout clothes, obnoxious patterned leggings, hoodies, and trucker hats. She was not poor. If you're going to pretend to be a hotshot lawyer, dress the part. I sat in the back, barely spoke, and still dressed in business casual out of respect for being in a nice and important building. Felt like a strange mix of entitlement and disrespect. A young teenage girl crying on the stand after recounting her alleged assault should not be asked intrusive personal questions by someone who couldn't be bothered to wear a suitable blouse. Story 56. Not me, but my girlfriend is a sex crimes prosecutor. Every time she conducts a grand jury, someone leaves crying. She has dealt with cases involving child abuse, torture, and homicide, and I would say those are probably the ones that hurt your soul the most. For regular sexual assault cases, she likes to open by asking the jury, who would like to share their personal experience regarding their body and their last sexual encounter? This helps explain why a victim on the stand might not be making eye contact or speaking confidently, and why that behavior does not necessarily mean they are being untruthful. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.